Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, Episode 35. I am your host, Stephanie Corey, filling in for the late Richard Behrens, author of the Lizzie Borden Girl Detective series of mysteries. The Lizzie Borden Podcast is the only podcast entirely devoted to the study of the Borden murders of 1892, Lizzie Borden, and sometimes the history of her hometown, Fall River, Massachusetts. Produced by Nine Muses Books and Anna Behrens, each episode explores some aspect of the mystery that is Lizzie Borden, from the origins of the doggerel Lizzie Borden Took an Axe to a primer on the case by noted authors and experts, including dramatic readings of Richard Behrens' Lizzie Borden Girl Detective mystery series. In this episode, we interview Bruce Dorsey, author of the book Murder in a Mill Town: Sex, Faith, and the Crime That Captivated a Nation. This is the story of the Sarah Maria Cornell case and its societal ramifications, including social change, the birth of a new religion, popular culture, and jurisprudence. And now, the Lizzie Borden Podcast presents an interview with Bruce Dorsey. Bruce Dorsey is a professor of history at Swarthmore College. His research focuses on colonial and revolutionary America, early American Republic and antebellum America, gender and religion. He's the author of the award-winning book, Reforming Men and Women, Gender in the Antebellum City. He lives in New York City and Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. His new book, Murder in a Mill Town: Sex, Faith, and the Crime That Captivated a Nation, was published in 2023 by Oxford University Press and is a true work of historical scholarship. In fact, I think it combines all of your areas of interest and study that I mentioned previously into one interesting mystery story. Welcome.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this story.
It's an interesting tale. There have been other books on the Sarah Cornell murder case before, most notably one by Catherine Williams, who wrote Fall River: An Authentic Narrative in 1833, not even a year after the crime itself, and Fall River Outrage by David Richard Kasserman, published in 1986, which is sort of my introduction to this story. And as a note to our listeners, we'll be referring throughout the talk to Sarah Maria Cornell as Maria Cornell, which is based on your own research. And before we go any further, can you tell us why this is your preferred way to address her?
Yes, she was born and named Sarah Maria Cornell, but part of Cornell's story is that she was a woman who went by several different names over her short lifetime. And part of this was the question of her reputation. And at the trial of Reverend Avery for her murder, the defense tries to make a case that she was a disreputable woman, a woman without character, because she changed her name and moved around a lot. And it's true that she used variations on her name when she was faced with gossip or rumors spreading about her, and that threatened her ability to find work in the textile mills.
I mean, who wouldn't, right?
Yeah, exactly. And fortunately, there are letters from Maria Cornell to her family, to her mother and older sister, that Catherine Williams collected and printed in that book you just mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. And from these, we can see that she made a deliberate decision at a point in her life, one of the most important transformations in her life, when she makes her religious conversion to Methodism, that she's going to adopt Maria as her preferred name. This is the name she wanted her closest friends and family to use. When there are dozens of factory workers who knew her well, come and testify in the trial, they'll refer to Maria told me this, or she said that. And so it's clearly the name that she preferred. But Catherine Williams makes an argument. I can't verify that it was the name she chose when she was rebaptized as a Methodist, but I can say that she probably adopted it as well to avoid rumors that had spread for Sarah Cornell after she was caught shoplifting in Providence, Rhode Island, and started to work throughout the Rhode Island area mills. But when she died, just a few months after moving to Fall River, she returned to using her birth name, Sarah Maria Cornell, because there had been lots of rumors and stories about a Maria Cornell who'd been excommunicated from the Methodist Church. She felt it was the easiest way to be able to get hired and to avoid the problems that might encounter her at boarding houses or at the accounting rooms when she was asking for employment. And so when she dies, she's identified as Sarah Maria Cornell, and she enters a new consciousness for everyone as this victim of the terrible haystack murder that takes place in a farm in Tiverton right outside of Fall River. And that's the name that she becomes known to newspaper men at the time, to everyone who was talking about her in the midst of this scandal, even if she would have called herself Maria Cornell. So it was so much easier for me to use the name that she referred to herself as.
It's really interesting just to focus on that a little bit more. That makes her her own branding agent, right? So she's saying, this is who I identify as because I want to move away from that identity. And then when that identity gets besmirched or tainted in some way, then she moves to another identity. It's really smart, I think, for her to have control of her life that way, almost.
I agree. And I think it is a means by which she is taking control of her life. And it is the story of her brief adult life. It's about her search for her own independence and control over that life. It doesn't mean it wasn't facing people who tried to put constraints on it, told her when she had to get up, where she had to go to work, all of those kinds of things. But underneath it all, you can tell that this is a story of someone who wanted to have some measure of control over her own destiny, and using her own name would be part of that.
I think that her realness, the reality of her existence as a three-dimensional person comes through in your book. I think you spend a great deal of care in presenting her in a way that is neutral, but also allowing us into more private parts of her existence. And in doing so, she's a real flesh and blood character to us. She's not just this lady who is a part of this weird, mysterious story from 1832, but is actually modern in a lot of ways, in the way she's trying to navigate, her life and all alone, all
Right.
alone.
A deeply human story as well. We get a sense that her struggles are ones we can identify with. There's a point where I talk about the longing she has for a family that doesn't really accept her. They haven't accepted her because she's gone to work in the factories. They haven't accepted her because she converted to this more emotional and ecstatic religion, Methodism. So I do think that you can feel the sort of longing for her. There's one point where she's writing back to her family and saying, "Yeah, I haven't gotten letters in 2 years." And I imagine what it must have been like, because you didn't have mail delivered to your house or your doorstep in those days. You went to the post office to collect the mail under your name. That meant she went dozens of times to a post office in Lowell, Massachusetts, for example, and asked for, is there any mail for Maria Cornell? And to be turned around with humiliation that there wasn't. And that to me was part of the story I had to tell so people could understand and relate to those feelings.
It's really sad, actually. It's really
Yep,
sad, especially in an era of letter writing,
agreed.
to not have communication. Hmm. Can you talk about the scope of your research and tell us what it was like to get your hands on those primary documents that you used in the case, trial, letters, and all the other research that you did, of course, in the history of Methodism, even in the United States?
Yes, indeed. Before the Reverend Ephraim K. Avery's murder trial is over, and this trial takes place in Newport, Rhode Island, because keep in mind that the Maria Cornell was found across the state line in Rhode Island, so the trial is in the Supreme Court of Rhode Island. By the time it's over, it's the longest trial in the history of the United States at that time. When most trials, even for capital crimes, might last 1 or 2 days at the most, this trial lasted for a whole month. There were over 250 witnesses sworn to testify between preliminary hearings and the full trial. It took longer to pick a jury for this trial. It took longer for the attorneys to give their closing arguments than it usually took for a whole trial. As a result, it produced an enormous, voluminous set of records, trial reports, and the transcripts that were kept by newspapermen. And then there were newspaper articles about it. And there was all kinds of new print and popular media that was produced, thousands of pages of material, because this trial, especially after the verdict, sets off a nationwide scandal that lasts for nearly a year, and popular publications just explode off the presses. And I found examples of the books and pamphlets about this trial being sold as far away as South Carolina or as far out as Kentucky and Ohio. So people were reading it all throughout the United States. So I read through all of these writings, and fortunately, archives like the Fall River Historical Society had some of these records. The Rhode Island Historical Society in Providence has a great collection of this, including the trial papers, the notes and records from the Attorney General who prosecuted the trial. But I dug even farther than just the trial or even the newspaper accounts. I looked at the records of the mills where Cornell worked, and she worked in over a dozen different factories and factory towns over the 10 years that she was a mill worker. And again, the Fall River Historical Society had the last of those. I found the register for her last pay receipts for then, but I also saw the first mill that she worked in Jewett City, Connecticut, and everywhere in between. So I went to town records, I went to local archives where Cornell and Avery had lived. I looked deeply in the Methodist Church in New England archives that are at Boston University. And a wonderful other collection were the papers of Maria Cornell's extended family, especially the diary and letters of her grandfather, who was a wealthy manufacturer, Christopher Leffingwell, that are at Yale University. So these are the kind of rich sources that were available in this case. And it's wonderful for an historian. It's important for our listeners to understand as well that despite all of that, there are still many mysteries and unspoken things we don't know as well. So I oftentimes relied on a device that historians use called parallel accounts. So if I knew there were similar experiences, for example, the mill workers. If other mill workers wrote letters to their family and talked about what the working conditions were like, they give me insights into what Maria's working conditions were like. If other Methodists told me what the experience of being at a camp meeting was like, I didn't need it directly from the voice of Avery or Cornell to know those experiences. And those are called parallel accounts. We're not putting those words into their mouth, but they give us more insights into that. And then finally, this was a case that was so popular that it produced an enormous amount of popular culture as well, plays and songs and artwork and scathing cartoons and other kinds of devices. So this is the range and scope of the material that I drew upon to tell this tale.
Some of the research side of writing is the fun part. And, it's also the tedious part, transcribing information, making sure the accuracy of your notes and traveling to locations to do this research, which can be very exciting, and meeting librarians and archivists and, having conversations about your project and then them presenting you with their treasures that you can then read and interpret. That part to me is always like the best part. And it doesn't last long enough because at some point you have to sit down and you have to say, okay, it's time to start writing. And one of the things I really love about the book is the way it's written, the way it's organized, and the idea that popular culture surrounds this case. I especially like the way you theater bookend the whole story. And the book is actually broken up into acts, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, like in a theater. How did you decide that this was the way to have access into the story by creating this sort of theatrical presentation to the book?
Yes, nobody had written this story in this way before.
Nope.
Few
Nope.
histories are written in this particular way. You're familiar with what a history book might look like. It would be a kind of chronological tale of one chapter to the next. And I couldn't get away from how much this trial was unfolding as a drama in real life and on the stage. So it was not enough, I think, for Americans at that time to merely witness this trial live, and people packed the courtroom in Newport every day to see it, and they read by the thousands the trial on the written pages if they were literally there. But they longed too for this drama to be played out in front of them in popular culture. So two long-running plays were written and performed, one in Newport, the site of the trial itself, and a blockbuster hit that takes place in New York City and Manhattan that runs for 2 months. So I figured that it was probably one of the longest plays to run in the 19th century and certainly before the Civil War. And popular songs were written and sold and performed, and people could buy them cheaply and sing along with tunes they might know. But they were also performed repeatedly on stage. There's clear evidence that Broadway revues would take place and the stories would be sung. And I began to think about how any violent death is a disruption of the fabric of individual lives and communities. But not every murder turns into something that's larger than the crime itself. But every once in a while, a crime tends to take on greater significance and meaning. And we've become familiar with this. Eventually, Americans would come to understand that this is a defining feature of our popular culture, sensational criminal trials that get labeled the crime of the century, even if they seem to happen every decade or so. And, this started with the Lizzie Borden, we might say, and all the way to O.J. Simpson in our longing. But the Avery trial was the first of these, the first spectacular trial. And these kinds of spectacular cases are what anthropologists call social dramas. They start to revolve around something more than, is this person being tried guilty or innocent? And it forces people to start asking questions like, why did this happen? And what does it tell us about who we are and what's going on in our lives and the world around us? And I thought that this episode was that kind of social drama. So I organized the book to be a drama itself. It goes back and forth from the places where it starts, where the crowds are gathering where the curtain's going to rise for the first of these plays. People knew these stories. The fascinating part about this is it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a whodunit murder mystery. It wasn't an Agatha Christie tale that people went to. They knew what the outcome of the case was. What they longed for in many ways was to see something that reflected this social drama. They came because they thought they saw the changing society in which they lived in unfolding before their own eyes. They thought they saw in the saga's characters, whether that was the real characters of Maria Cornell and Ephraim Avery or the fictional characters that were created by playwrights, some glimpse of their family members, their sisters, their own friends and family. And they saw keenly that the issues that mattered most in their lives were now being played out in a legal thriller. So that's the reason why I decided that it would be best to organize this in a way that people would understand the drama of the event for real people and for audiences as well.
It's a great way to tell the story. I just plugged into it right away. It also kind of eases you into the idea because it starts off with a performance and you're like, what? And then, oh, no way. So you're there afterwards, and then seeing it represented is and then back into the story. And maybe we should tell, in case someone listening doesn't know what we're talking about with Sarah Maria Cornell and the Avery case. Can you briefly describe what this story is about? Just overview.
Certainly. It's a story with lots of twists and turns and surprises, but at its center was the story of a young woman who works in the new factory mills that are popping up all over southern New England, and also becomes converted to the fastest growing religion at that time. That's the Methodist Church, the group that organizes these outdoor gatherings called camp meetings, the kind of Woodstocks of their era. And she encounters this Methodist preacher and minister over the course of her life, not as in a romantic relationship, but in a hostile relationship. He's the one who excommunicates her from the Methodist Church in Lowell because of her sexual behavior. She's tried for, at that time, quote, fornication and lying, end quote. And her life is thrown into disarray. And when she is found dead at a haystack outside of Fall River, a farm outside of Fall River, the story starts to unfold that she had met with a doctor. She had confided in him that she was pregnant, that she believed the father to be Reverend Ephraim Avery. The fascinating part about this story, and readers can see this when they open the first scene of Act One, is that she left behind a little note in her bandbox, a hand-scribbled penciled note that said, dated the day of her death, that said, if I am missing, inquire of Reverend Mr. Avery of Bristol. He will know where I am. And signed by her on that day. And that set off the mystery of how did this happen. He eventually is arrested. The local justices of the peace in Bristol, Rhode Island, don't want to send him off to be tried elsewhere, so they can conduct a long preliminary examinations, nearly longer than any other trial would be, only to exonerate him based on the argument that a clergyman could never have committed a crime like this.
Okay.
Yes, and that a woman of her reputation can't be believed compared to a married man and a respectable Methodist minister. And he's set free, but the town of Fall River is dissatisfied that this is really the means of justice. And by the time they seek out another arrest warrant, he has gone into hiding. So the story adds the dimension of a fugitive chase from justice. And a lawman from Fall River named Harvey Harnden takes a little over a week to hunt him down over 3 states and find him. And then he proceeds to write a best-selling whodunit kind of detective tale of the search for Avery. And then Avery is eventually brought to trial in Newport for this longest trial. And it won't spoil the story for listeners to know that a jury finds him not guilty, and it sets off an even longer battle in the public press and in the streets over his guilt and innocence. That's the third act of this play, the scandal itself, and the way this erupts into something even larger than this trial.
It's interesting that you say that the man charged with murdering Maria, Ephraim Avery, or you say Ephraim, right?
Yes, it could be either one. Yeah.
Okay. He left no stories in his own voice, no personal letters, no autobiography. He wrote nothing of his childhood, his work, or how he chose his occupation, his spouse, or conversion. And you write, quote, when given the chance to make a statement on his own defense before and after the trial, he spoke only of events that began once he encountered Maria Cornell in Lowell, unquote. Now, that makes a tough slog towards a balanced story, doesn't it? And yet you pull it off. Why do you think Avery was so silent about his own life, or did he destroy everything that he had written about his life later?
I think there were some records that were not kept, not necessarily intentionally destroyed in that form. But I think this is a wonderful question. I just love this thought because as I write in the book, Ephraim Avery and Maria Cornell were not extraordinary people. They were in many ways very ordinary people, just like so many others around them, but they lived in extraordinary times and there was much to find out about them. But Ephraim Avery was a bit of an enigma. Yes, he belonged to a religious faith that emphasized storytelling. It was a part of their experiences, but he still left no permanent written record of his life story. The Methodists were such a storytelling people. They wanted to tell others about their spiritual lives and experience. That means their past sins, the change in their lives once they believed the message that they had found a savior. Maria writes about this to her family and such, but Avery didn't, as far as I know, write or save letters, and that he didn't keep a diary. But I'm fairly confident that he told some people in his lifetime in verbal stories his own personal story. It's just the way Methodists were. He was most likely to say it when he stood at a pulpit and he gave sermons, when he was at a camp meetings giving a fiery address. He might say and tell his personal story. In fact, no person could become a Methodist minister without narrating that tale in some ways. But I don't have any record of that because it just didn't come down to us. But people at the same time had encounters with him. They met him and found out something about it. And this plays a large part in my tale of who he was, how they wrote about his encounters. They saw him as an ambitious man who wanted not to end up as a landless tenant farmer like his father in the middle of Connecticut with little hope for his economic prospects in the new age. He wanted to become a professional man, a man of God, a clergyman in the fastest growing, largest religious group in the United States. And so he became a circuit rider, those well-known characters of preachers with a saddlebag and on a horse and traveling around and so on. And but he was also a striver, what we would call a man on the make. He was somebody who was wanted to rise fast, and he did rise fast in the Methodist Church. So people encountered this person who's trying to succeed, and he, many ways, tried to succeed by being a disciplinarian. So we know that part of him. So so some people experienced him as an angry man, a person who wanted to punish them for sins they'd committed. He was even sued and found guilty of slandering a rival clergyman for slander and libel. Had to pay a settlement for that. So that gives us some insights into who he was and what his life was. And it was as much a challenge to try to bring the life of Ephraim Avery to the page as it was to try to bring the life of Maria Cornell.
And his complexity is tied to his hypocrisy, isn't it?
Yes, yes. And to the way that they both become representations of something else, so that we can't sometimes separate who they are from what they are. He's the circuit rider, the Methodist preacher. She's the factory girl. These are stock characters in people's minds of who they should be, but they were more complex than that. And they were more complex because they didn't fit in exactly into the molds. And so in his case, he didn't fit into the mold of being a person who left behind a tale we would understand, a tale of redemption that started early in his life. But he also was a person who didn't fit in because of what clearly seemed to have been his sexual exploitation of the less powerful, including Maria Cornell.
And he excommunicates her, and yet he indulges himself with her and seems a bit nasty, man.
Well,
quite a
yeah.
religious hypocrite, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's part of what makes this story so compelling for people. Here's the person who kicks her out of the church for her sexual illicit sexual behavior, and then uses that to extort sex from her that results in her pregnancy.
Because she's easy. She's
Yeah.
easy. Right?
Yes, right.
Yeah. Oh my God. And the book is also a story about Methodism and the birth of this religious movement. And it's quite powerful and long lasting. In a way, it's also the story of the early days and ways of America, especially New England. What part of this story, which is your area of expertise, right? Early American religion. What part of this story originally drew you to it? Was it Maria Cornell? Was it Avery? Was it Methodism? Was it murder? I mean, why'd you decide to write this book? What was the first thing that went, oh, there's a story there I want to tell?
Yes. So the answer, in fact, is the many facets of the story is what really attracted me to it. I am fascinated by history in which there are intersections of many things, whether that's economics and religion and popular culture and gender roles and other things that might be happening. And this was a case that was about so many different matters. And in the course of this research, I ran across a phrase that one of the reporters at Avery trial called this the most extraordinary of all extraordinary cases, which is a great phrase for everything that it touched upon. And in his words, there was law for the lawyer and anatomy for the doctor and theology for the minister and knots and navigation for the sailors. There were counting houses and shopkeepers for the men of commerce and so on and so forth. Seemingly for every occupation, there was something you would find here. In fact, he wrote, a person could learn more about human nature by attending just one day at this trial than they could learn from reading books for a whole year. So that's a great description of how much was going on. And for me as an historian, it was about more history in this episode than any historian could dream about. It was about the economic transformation of an era, but it was also about the political changes that were happening at that moment. And it was a deeply human tale about a young woman who was searching for independence at the moment that women, for the first time, start to appear in large numbers in the wage earning workforce. So it's about changing ideas about women and gender and men and masculinity, about love and sex and it ends up also being about the invention of things that we're familiar with, like true crime and fake news and detective tales and the like. And it's about America's penchant for a kind of conspiracy style of politics
And
that,
sensationalism.
yes, and sensation. That's another good one as well. And a form of a communications revolution that is important for us to realize. We live in one ourselves in the digital age that we have. And this is an era in which more material was coming off presses and available for people to read in cheaper forms than ever before. That creates its own dilemmas of who do you believe and who can you trust? And it was an era of new religions coming into being. And that also asks you, who do you believe and what's really true about that? So, and one thing I've been thinking recently about it, and this was attracted over the course of working on the book, it became part of the attraction for me, is this case also asks the question of how does criminal justice work in a popular democracy? And this is, I think, in our own moment in time where we're plagued with this question. Can the courts and the criminal justice system be trusted to hold people accountable for crimes when political forces are pushing and pulling and tugging at the levers of justice and punishment? So I hope readers who are interested in any of those or all of those topics will pick up the book and find it a compelling tale
And
and
this
a
is
lot
an
of.
era when in the judicial process where defendants were not allowed to testify on their own behalf. Is that right?
Well, I think that defendants could. I think that hasn't changed that much, that it's unlikely for defense attorneys to put a defendant on trial because they,
I thought I read something that they weren't even allowed
no,
to, if they wanted to, get on the stand.
yes, they could have brought Avery to the stand, and
Oh, okay.
there was no way they were going to do that. Instead, they had the convenience of putting other people to speak for him, say what he told them, and that would stand for his statements, and therefore he didn't have to be cross-examined on those statements that somebody else was saying that he said at some point. What is fascinating about this trial, of course, is it is typical of trials that are oftentimes pivot around sexual crimes, is that the defense attorneys decided they would put the victim of the crime on trial. Reporters at the time, many of them called it the trial of Sarah Maria Cornell rather than the trial of Ephraim Avery, for how much of it was about her life and her character and such.
How much has your understanding of the murder case part of it progressed after all this study and writing? I mean, did you just say, "Oh yeah, he's the guy that killed her," even though he was found not guilty, not only by the jury but by the church itself? So do we trust the legal system to say they got it right, or are we forever in that OJ area where we're like, wait a minute, he's guilty of sin, but there's other stuff going on here. So how did you navigate that? Did you think going into it that he was guilty and come up with a different idea, or the opposite?
I thought at all times that this was a case with a lot of complexity and nuance beyond the ability for everyone to figure out. And the deeper dug into it, peeling back like the layers of an onion, the deeper I understood that there were many stories to tell about this case, many different ways of understanding it, but ultimately the vast majority of people at that time did believe that he was complicit in her death. The defense makes an argument that I think the more I spent researching it, the less likely I find palpable, and that's that she committed suicide to
Mm,
enact some revenge against him. It's just not possible. A key moment of this trial, of course, it has to do with the kind of knot that she was
mm,
found suspended, and literally, she would have had to have been able to simultaneously strangle herself with a knot and tie herself to the post that hangs her, because she didn't hang by a slip knot or a noose that would have done both of those simultaneously. And so the chance of that is just it's just not physically possible for that to happen.
this is a case we can add to the growing canon of very sensational murder trials that are seep into the popular culture, where people firmly believe the person was guilty and yet they're found not guilty. Starting with this case, then you've got the Lizzie Borden case, then
Yes.
you have the OJ case, and you have the Casey Anthony case. So all of these are media driven stories that are sensationalized through the press, through Facebook, through Twitter, through all kinds of social radio with the OJ case, television broadcasts the case, and yet the none of them were found guilty. And yet people still think they were. So do you think that that kind of attention at the time influences the decision of the juries?
I'm not sure that it influences the juries in that way. In most of these cases, if we think about it, especially let's take the O.J. Simpson case and the Avery case, we can look back and see, I could understand why a jury might be convinced by Johnny Cochran's argument that the glove didn't fit. How could this be a murderer if the person can't even fit their hand into the glove that's supposedly it happened with? And in this case, Avery and the Methodists are able to hire the most famous trial attorney in all of America to,
All these cases have great
yeah,
trial attorneys, all of them.
exactly. And they come up with a brilliant strategy in Avery's defense, which is to both to confuse the jurors over a long period of time, but also
Mhm.
to give them an out, which is that eventually convince them that this woman whose life was not the ordinary, that she had didn't fit the patterns of respectability, that she was really behind it all a bit mad, a bit crazy. You can't trust what she could do or not. So that whenever the prosecution would come back and say that, well, this is the most illogical argument the defense is ever making. Well, logic doesn't matter anymore because a crazy person could do whatever it is. Because it doesn't make any sense that a woman would decide to enact vengeance on someone and do it by ending her own life and do it in a public way. Why not just, stick around and watch the consequence of it? There's no logic to that. But the logic part of it didn't make a difference if you'd given the jury the out that maybe you can't believe that she really is trustworthy in that way. So I can understand why a jury of 12 had enough reasonable doubt to not come forward with a guilty verdict. But what's fascinating is that people now had to begin to trust, can we trust juries at all? Can we trust this process? How does the opinion of the public get expressed if it can't be expressed through this institution that's supposed to be in a democratic society, the one that we trust as the voice of the community or the voice of the people? Instead, they begin to suggest maybe we need to try this in another means, and it's tried in the newspapers and in
Right, right.
theaters and other places. And they do that. They literally try it to the point where it is impossible for Avery to ever be a practicing preacher again, and he has to slip off into anonymity to go back to a life that he wanted its most in his life to avoid, to be a unknown landless farmer that lives on the edge of poverty and such. And that's what his life would be for the rest of the 30 years that are after this case.
Well, he was a big man on campus with the Methodist Church.
Yes.
He
Yeah.
was that guy that they depended on to do all that riding on his horse going from town to town. He was dependable and charismatic, and he was a great salesperson for the religion. So of course the higher ups in the new Methodist religion were supporting him because they needed him to come back to work,
Yes.
And but the irony is he never did.
Yeah, and they tried hard in the aftermath, and you find this oftentimes the case because there were not only the Methodists, but a number of folks we would call conservative, religious people who believed in some ways that this wasn't good for churches. This was maybe all a plot to try to keep down the spread of new and growing evangelical religions, and they wanted Avery to be able to come back exonerated, and that you could trust a man of the cloth in those cases, but they were outnumbered by the voices much louder and more vociferous in their complaints about his
whipped
guilt.
up by the Whipped up by the press.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So back to the popular culture aspect, which informs this story quite a bit. Why do you think this story resonated with playwrights, storytellers, and other creative types like poets and novelists, besides the impulse to dramatize something that is so dramatic?
Yes, right. But I think they did want an explanation for this downfall and hypocrisy of a man of God, and they wanted to know about the experience of this young, unprotected woman who's vulnerable to the machinations of something larger, whether that was the mill owners or the Methodist hierarchy, how she became vulnerable to the advances of powerful men at different times. And I think it wasn't just playwrights who were interested in it. They knew their audiences were going to be interested in exactly these same types of things. And that's the way theater was in that time. It was very participatory. People wanted stories that they could do. They called out in the middle of performances, sometimes asked them to sing songs that they knew, even if they weren't even related to the play. It's very likely they called out for the famous songs of the Avery case just to be sung by the leading actors or whatever. A song by the title of The Factory Maid that goes, the chorus goes, "Oh, weep for Maria, the poor factory maid, so charming, so fair, and so basely betrayed." They wanted to know how she became so betrayed and what was that story. And I think that some part of it was the social dramas of the changing era that which they lived. The people in the midst of a rapidly changing society started to question some of the foundations of their beliefs about religion, family, and men and women's roles and politics. And they came up with the explanations that made the most sense to them. And oftentimes they turn to devices of storytelling that we're familiar with. May not be actually explain the kinds of reasons how those changes happen, but they made some more sense to tell it as a seduction tale, a
And she
story.
gets to be a victim in these stories, right?
Yeah,
As opposed
she
to the
did.
way she was presented at trial, which
Yeah,
is a sort of demonized the victim in that case and made her responsible for her own death, even if she didn't kill herself.
yeah. I agree with that wholeheartedly. In fact, I came at the very end of writing this book to this question that was nagging at me. Why were there so few women voices that came to the defense of Maria Cornell? This was a beginning era of when maybe there were starting to be women writers and a host of other things, but very few women become public figures who stand up for her in the public before or after her death. And I understood this. The risk of doing so would have been tremendous. You were standing up for a woman who was thought to be sexually promiscuous and full of vice and danger and so on. And it would smear the reputation of whoever aligned themselves with her. But I do think that the audience was filled with women who wanted to see that story, wanted to see her tale told in a different way, that she was no longer just the pariah who'd been sent off as undesirable, but a person who'd been the victim of these circumstances. The way those plays are, the content of them seems to imply that, and the way in which the actress who plays Maria Cornell in New York, Matilda Flynn, who was a Broadway star, is able to bring her to life, gives that sort of sense that she's now a figure that's different than the way she was presented in the trial. So I agree with that point.
So she becomes sort of an icon, that her story resonates beyond the trial, her death. There's like you said, there's a complexity to the tendons that reach out from into all of society, right?
Yes,
So it's a bigger story than her
it is.
eventually.
Yeah, and I think she does come to represent some of those things for people. As I said, it's a conflict that people understood regardless of whether they worked in factories or they converted to Methodism. But at the same time, she was also the most notorious factory girl. She was the most notorious camp meeting convert. So she became a symbol for those points of view where people could fight in battle over those particular sort of experiences as well.
Do you think she was destined to be a Methodist, or if she had not turned in that direction, would she not have been killed?
There's so many places where if she'd taken a different turn, there's possibilities of that. But I do think that's true. I don't think she's destined to be a Methodist. I think, however, when she wanted to have the most control over her own life, the independence of making her own decision, it's not a coincidence that she chose a religion that had a theology that put, as I call it, the first person at the center of this. The word I, first person pronoun, I say elicited a theological revolution. Methodists started to talk about a new kind of perspective. I'm in charge of my own spiritual destiny. I feel that I have a new savior. I can make these choices and so on. And so for a woman who's starting to emphasize her own independence, the theology she was hearing among Methodists was extremely attractive to her, rather than the Calvinism of her family's experience that would have told her everything's in God's hands. You're not in charge of your own destiny. She rejects that and chooses a new faith that emphasizes personal agency and so forth. I don't know if she's destined for that, but it certainly was more attractive to her.
But she's also a victim of the religion itself
Yes.
because she tries to be a good Methodist. She goes to the meetings and she confesses herself, but she confesses about things that happened a really long time ago. And so they hold it against her and they repeat it and it becomes gossip. So there's this bad part of Methodism where if you reveal yourself to people, that stuff is going to be shared. And then you get a reputation, even though it happened 15 years ago or 10 years ago, or you already paid the money back and you're not that person anymore. But because she reveals her transgressions to this group of people, she gets a bad reputation among the group of people who she's doing the right thing with by being a Methodist and revealing her humanness to them. She's not smart enough to keep it to herself because she's a fervent believer in the process. But it comes back to bite her badly.
It definitely does. I'm glad that part of the story came through. It's something that's very original to my version of this story as well. In the middle of the act two in the trials, I have a scene that I call bad stories, and it's the scene where the women who are both work alongside Maria but also worship alongside Maria, they want to ask her about her stories about her sexual encounters and behavior. Even though they know these are bad stories, they ask more questions about them. They don't just shun her and say, "Stop talking. This is something you shouldn't." They're interested in it. They're interested in part because it's a tale that's supposed to have a redemptive
Mhm.
storyline, but I think they're also interested in it because it is part of a struggle that they're thinking about themselves in some way. And that's what I wanted to unveil, that it is a religious culture that encouraged those things, and then people paid the price for participating in it in
It's
some
a
way.
public confession among the Methodists themselves as a group of people. And they're humans who were like, oh, gossip.
Yes.
Like, let me go tell what I just heard because, oh my gosh, like this sheep was like a shoplifter. Oh, whoa, and but she had repented all of that. She had paid the price. She was a
Right.
better person, but yet it stung her and stayed on her and followed her like pigpen,
Yeah.
this dirt that she carried with her because she was doing what she thought the religion asked of her, and yet
I
it
had
held against her.
I agree. I had to dig deeply to find the sources where people said the things that were happening for years upon years for her, that she was a good and faithful attender of the meetings, that she was a person who prayed deeply and with emotion and feeling, the kind of things that would have been positive statements. Instead, they remembered the,
Mhm.
the bad stories, the few things that they could keep in their memory. And when they bring them back into a courtroom, then they become a different tale. They have a resonance that we don't expect from them. They're no longer part of a confessional religious conversation. They're part of an accusatory statement about who this person is and their character
And
and so
embarrassing her family
yes.
and her in Connecticut, embarrassing everyone.
Yeah.
At the trial, she's gone. She has no voice, and all these people are saying these things about her, and she can't defend herself. And the
Yes.
prosecution is not defending her because that's not their job. They're trying to prosecute somebody, and she's stuck in this place of being wanton, and that wasn't it didn't wholly define her. And yet that wholly defined her at the trial.
Right. And I think that's why her story speaks to us today and makes real for us this past that predates the Me Too movement. It raises this question of how do you make sure you believe the women who are telling tales of their victimization by sexual predators of one kind or another? Who's to be believed in these cases is the question that this case brings up. And I think that's why her her story seems so resonant to us. I think she could is in some ways an icon of a past that we can relate to.
Yeah, and if it had been today where this had happened, Avery would certainly had made a comeback.
Yes.
It's
There
his
was.
era of expulsion from society for these acts that does him in, that makes him that guy he didn't want to be. But in today's world, I mean, you see all these people coming back into popularity and getting jobs again where they were shunned from us not too long ago because of their actions that were made public. It's
Indeed.
that in and of itself, that story of how the worm turns is interesting in this respect for this story too, how it would have played out in more modern days.
Yes.
What's your ultimate judgment of Avery? Is he a bad man who got away with a horrible crime, or is he a victim himself?
A victim? No, he's definitely not.
Okay.
Even though that's exactly how he thought of himself. We started this conversation about how he only left behind one statement of his story, and it began with the moment that he first encounters Maria Cornell. It's a tale that he is a martyr, a victim. He's been persecuted by being unfairly connected to a woman whose reputation he was trying to
Hmm.
push out of the church, and he's being that. So I think in some ways at that point he's then telling a story where he's a victim who this is bringing him closer to his God. This is providing a sort of faith experience for him in some ways. But I tried to tell a story in a way that was both accurate and fair to who he was as a man and as a clergyman in this era. And it's true, I never explicitly say in my own voice that the Reverend Avery killed Maria Cornell. And in part, this was a deliberate, conscious decision as a writer that although the most important question in his day is, was he guilty or not? Did he do it? I think what's most compelling to me about this story, what makes the case matter the most, were other questions of why did this story explode in the way that it did? Why didn't it just go away? And why were the vast majority of people thinking him guilty and not finding that satisfying when he was declared not guilty by a jury's trial? In fact, this is the one known case I know of where just reading about this trial, just talking about it and speaking of it results in at least two other violent deaths as people fought over the account of it. So I wanted to allow readers to understand who he was and what his life was like and base their decision based on the evidence itself. And I wanted readers to make some of their own
Hmm.
judge. This is partly why I use a little quotation as the epigraph for the whole book that comes from a pseudonym pamphleteer, a Unitarian minister named Jacob Fries wrote a pamphlet under the name of Aristides to indict Avery and the Methodist Church. And it was more about indicting the Methodist Church for being the ones who were complicit in bringing him forward and then shielding him from coming to justice. And Aristides wrote, "What think you of Ephraim K. Avery? Is he guilty or not guilty? Read, try, judge, and determine for yourselves." And so every
Well,
reader
if we
can.
look, if we're trying to look for justice in some way from this, I guess him not ending up with the life that he wanted is a bit of a punishment. I guess he still gets to live and he gets to live, what, 30 years more? But he's certainly an anonymous person after that.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's not what he wanted.
No, he didn't want that. He wanted to be a person of reputation as a man, a profession, a leader in the in the greatest, most popular religious group in the country, and he didn't get that. But
What's your next project going to be about? Do you have something in mind, or is it too secret right now and too formulating in your brain to actually talk about it?
no, I'm in the midst of the research and starting the writing on a new book, and readers will, I don't think will be surprised that it is about the conflicts over exactly these same topics of religion and sexuality and popular culture and gender and such. I'm writing a book about the origins of the culture wars in our own time. It's about the late 1970s, the era in which Anita Bryant launches an anti-gay rights campaign and the beginning of a gay activism in response to that. The rise of Harvey Milk is the figure of an elected gay official in San Francisco. It's the story of the first transgender athlete, Renee Richards, comes to play in professional sports. It's the era of the rise of the religious right and the spread of kind of evangelical politics that are going to define American politics for a while. It's a book about the year that Elvis Presley dies and punk rock begins and disco takes off. And so it's all of those stories put together as a tale of conflict over these same struggles. But I'm happy to tell people that that's the project that I'm working on. I'm excited about the way I can bring the same skills of storytelling and unveiling the drama of a moment to that time period.
Excellent. This book, Murder in a Milltown, is a really great read and an unexpected page turner, but not in the whodunit sense, which is kind of what I thought, because it's not a true crime book. I'm left feeling the reality of these people and their times, and I feel a connection with Maria and her sad story. And it's not a dry explanation of what happened. It really fleshes out the people involved and offers us a way to understand their experience. I guess I'm trying to say I'm a really big fan of your writing, and I'm very happy you wrote this book because there isn't another book like it on this case. So great.
Thank you, Stephanie. It was wonderful talking to you about it.
Thank you.
And I'm always happy when my intention comes through in a book that I'm writing.
Oh, well, I'm glad that you saw that I got it because I did. I just fell into the book and stayed in the book and didn't want to put it down and marveled at the way you told the story, the way you crafted the tale in such an interesting way that hadn't been told before. So it's a very important work, I think, on this story and that period of time in American history. So thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, episode 35. We've been speaking with Bruce Dorsey, author of the book Murder in a Milltown: Sex, Faith, and the Crime That Captivated a Nation. Find Richard Barron's Lizzie Borden Girl Detective Stories at Amazon.com and at LizzieBordenGirlDetective.com, where you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Listen to more Lizzie Borden podcasts on our website or on Podbean, Audible, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube. Please support this podcast through a subscription on Patreon. Thank you.